under, oh, excuse me.
Okay.
Under the first cause of action. And we are proving we are proving that the defendant failed to adhere to best piloting practices. Next, the plaintiff would like to draw your attention to page 4 of your case law. And it's Murray v. Harney, which states that if the defense is arguing another intervening act caused the crash, the act must be independent and unforeseen. The defense takes on the burden of proof.
Okay. Noted.
The plaintiff would also like to draw your attention to stipulation 7, which pre-admits exhibits 1, 4A, 5A through 5C, and 12.
Which ones did you say that?
Stipulation 7.
Okay. Okay, sounds good, Counsel.
Finally, the plaintiff would like to draw your attention to Special Instruction Navarra. It's Special Instruction 21. And this states that no guilty portrayal, which no guilty portrayals, which means the defense cannot blame any of their own witnesses for wrongdoing. And with that, the plaintiff would like to invoke Rules 615 and 603, which call for the constructive sequestration of all witnesses barring party representatives, and swearing in all witnesses.
Thanks, Counsel.
Additionally, as we have not appeared in your honors court before, what are your preferences for moving about the well?
You can move about the well if you're going to approach us, defense counsel, or an opposing witness. Ask us. If it's your own witness, you may do so.
Yes, Your Honor. When an objection is sustained, would you prefer we move to strike any offending testimony or assume stricken?
Ask to strike.
Yes, Your Honor. With that, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to proceed into opening statements.
Let's do it.
Your Honor, we do have housekeeping matters to attend to. Your Honor, since this is the first time in the courtroom, would you prefer that we address these both the judge and jury, or should we just assume that you are the judge?
You can just address us as the judge. That's fine.
And with that, defense is ready to proceed to opening statements.
Okay.
Opening statements, Your Honor.
Yes, you may.
May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury. He had a choice, but he took a chance. Members of the jury, when we step on an airplane to go visit family, friends, loved ones, we expect certain things. We expect that a seat will be reserved for us. We expect that the fuel tank prior to departure will be filled. We expect that the flight staff will be trained for regulation to handle any circumstance that might arise in the air. Members of the jury, at the very least, we expect that when our pilot is faced with a choice, he never takes a chance on the lives of his passengers. Now, before I continue into the details of today's case, I'd like to introduce you all to the plaintiff today, Ms. Ari Felder. Now, Ms. Felder lost her husband last summer. His name was Morgan Felder. Now, Morgan went on a flight last July, just the same way that we might. And Ms. Felder held all of those expectations, just the same way that we might. She expected to see her Morgan again. But on July 4th, 2021, Reese Campbell, the pilot of Morgan's aircraft, and indeed the co-founder and co-owner of the defendant in today's case, Collar Campbell Air, LLC, failed to meet those expectations. In fact, he fell far short. Now, on that day, Mr. Campbell invited Morgan, an associate at his law firm, on a test flight around the Rapid River Valley. Test flight, members of the jury, that ended when Mr. Campbell drove the aircraft into the side of Mount McIntosh, causing the death of both men. It's because those two men are not here with us today that you are. Now, the plaintiff has brought a suit of negligence, alleging that Mr. Campbell, in fact, did not adhere to best piloting practices on the night of July 4th of 2021. Now, as part of this charge, we must prove to you its 4 elements. Those elements are duty, breach, injury, and causation. What do those look like in the scope of today's trial? The duty Reese Campbell owed to Morgan Felder as pilot of the aircraft, the breach of said duty, and injury being inflicted upon Morgan Felder, and that injury being a direct cause of Reese Campbell's actions. Now, 2 of those 4 elements are not really at issue in today's trial. You see, the defense counsel has already conceded that Mr. Campbell did in fact owe a duty of care to Morgan Felder. And, well, members of the jury, there's hardly disputing an injury in today's case. Morgan Felder is dead. Now, those 2 remaining pieces of the puzzle, we must prove those 2 things to you by a preponderance of the evidence. What does that mean? Essentially, we must prove those things to you more likely than not. So at the end of trial today, if you feel that Mr. Campbell was more likely negligent than not, even by a single percentage of a margin, you must hold Collar Campbell Air, LLC liable. To prove those 2 elements to you, I'd like to draw your attention now to the 3 choices that Mr. Campbell made that evening. The choice to ignore his lack of flight training, the choice to take off in the first place, and the choice not to turn around. Training, take off, turn around. Let's break those down and begin with training. Really, Mr. Campbell's lack thereof. Now, we'll call to the stand the man himself who trained Mr. Campbell, leading up to his private pilot's license exam and up to the date of the crash. His name is Aubrey Roy. Mr. Roy will come before you and tell you that Mr. Campbell wasn't even comfortable handling the instruments in his own airplane. He had completed the bare minimum of flight requirements leading up to his pilot's license exam. And just a month before the time of the crash, Mr. Campbell chose to switch training aircraft to one with more sensitive controls. Despite all of those facts, members of the jury, Mr. Campbell still flew, bringing me to that second choice, the choice to leave the tarmac at all. Now we'll call to the stand expert accident reconstructionist Drew Hubbard. We'll tell you about the conditions in the sky that night. They were inclement conditions. Inclement conditions that Mr. Campbell was not qualified to fly in. Now D.B. Gelfand, a local stunt pilot with years of experience, will tell you that Mr. Campbell had ways of anticipating those inclement conditions before and after taking off. Believe it or not, members of the jury, even after entering those conditions, Mr. Campbell still had options. He still had a life-saving choice to make, bringing me to that third choice, the choice not to turn around. Now, he didn't turn around. It's as simple as that. And in fact, he didn't even call for help on the ground from air traffic control, not until 2 minutes before the time of the crash, only when it was too late. Now, members of the jury, all of these choices compounded, and all of the chances that Mr. Campbell took in the air that evening, all of those things were the reasons for Morgan Felder's death. And at the end of trial today, my co-counsel, Kennedy Honors, will come before you and request that you deliver the only verdict that upholds the law, the truth, and delivers justice to the plaintiff in today's case, Ms. Felder. Thank you.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to prepare the law? Members of the jury, opposing counsel, may it please the court. He could not have prepared for this. Reese Campbell had a passion, flying. He spent his days as an attorney at a notable law firm right here in Midlands. But his true dream, piloting his own plane. Reese Campbell was so passionate about turning his dream into a reality that he reached out to Casey Collar. The two of them started drafting up a plan. After buying the planes and picking out a name, Collar Campbell Air LLC is born. It's July 4th, 2021, and after meticulous planning, Reese Campbell is ready to take flight. He's done everything right. He's gotten the training, he has his license, he's done the maintenance on his plane. Members of the jury, he could not have prepared for what happened that evening. Morgan Felder is his passenger and everything is going well. The sky is clear, the flight is going smooth, but suddenly things take a turn for the worse. While in the air, the Horizon P229 plane suffered from engine failure, to the fault of no one on board. Now, we as the defense have taken on a burden today to show that it wasn't the fault of Mr. Campbell, but it was an unforeseeable cause. And we must prove this burden by the preponderance of the evidence. We must show you three things. First, that engine failure was sufficient enough by itself to cause harm. Second, that engine failure was not reasonably foreseeable to the defendant. And lastly, that engine failure was not a direct result of the defendant's conduct. And to show that on July 4th, engine failure occurred, we will call forward three witnesses. First, you will hear from Manny Navarro, the plane's technician, who will tell you that he green-lighted that plane to fly. He wasn't the last person who touched it. Second, you will hear from Ms. Kennedy Heisman, an aerospace engineer who will tell you about the inner workings of planes and engines, and how in-flight engine failure could have occurred. And lastly, you'll hear from Ms. Casey Collar herself, who will tell you that she and Reese did everything that they could, but they could not have prepared for this. Members of the jury, two people are dead. Two people who will not return to their friends, their families, their livelihoods. Despite what the plaintiff wants you to believe, it's not the fault of Reese Campbell. It's not the fault of Casey Collar. It's not the fault of Collar Campbell Air LLC. To take away the business of a woman who had nothing to do with it is unjust. Members of the jury, preponderance of the evidence asks you to consider what is more reasonable. Is it more reasonable that a fully trained VFR pilot would fly in conditions he wasn't ready for? Or is it more reasonable that the unforeseeable happened? At the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Van Zandt, will get up here and detail to you that it's more reasonable that the unforeseeable happened. And we ask that you find that the only verdict that justice allows, you find Collar Campbell Air LLC not liable. Thank you.
Yes, you may.
The plaintiff calls to the stand, Aubrey Roy. Would you introduce yourself to the court?
Hi, my name is Aubrey Roy.
Mr. Roy, what do you do for a living?
I'm a certified flight instructor. I've owned and operated my own flight company, Roy's Wings, since 2010.
And how did you come into this line of work?
Well, first I was in the legal field, but then I met my wife. Anyway, to answer your question, my family's been flying planes practically for generations, since the Wright brothers. You can say I was born with wings.
And what sorts of planes do you know how to fly?
Well, I can fly literally anything you put me in. I have all my certifications and ratings to fly different planes in different weather conditions, including my certified flight instructor rating, which means that I can help other people obtain their instrument ratings.
So tell us, Mr. Roy, how are you involved in today's case?
I was Mr. Campbell's flight instructor
When did Mr. Campbell begin flight training with you?
in January of 2021.
And what sort of license was he working toward?
At the time, we were working on obtaining his PPL, or his private pilot license. Now, this is just the lowest level of licensing.
And what does a PPL, private pilot's license, allow a pilot to do in the air?
Well, you can take a plane into the air. You can't get paid for it. You can't fly at night or in poor weather conditions. Only during the day and when the weather is good, because you're only trained to rely on what you can see.
Did Mr. Campbell ever receive his PPL?
Yes, Mr. Campbell obtained his PPL in only 5 months, with only 40 hours under his belt. Now, this is the bare minimum and not what I recommend to my students.
What do you recommend to your students?
Look, in my experience, when you take a plane into the air, you get a euphoric sense of freedom. But I always have to remind my students that it's dangerous. And any time you take a plane to the air, your life's in danger. So I recommend 60 to 80 hours of flight experience before they even think about taking their PPL.
Now, beyond the PPL, private pilot's license, what sort of licensure can a pilot pursue?
Well, after obtaining their PPL, they can obtain their IR certification, or their instrument rating.
And how exactly is that different from a PPL?
An instrument rating allows a pilot to fly in inclement weather conditions, or weather conditions that force a pilot to rely solely on their instruments.
Did Mr. Campbell receive his instrument rating?
No, unfortunately, he passed on July 4th. Just a bad day for him.
How could you know it was a bad day to fly, Mr. Roy?
Well, according to the KRV weather app, the standard app used by all pilots in the Midlands area, they released a special weather report at 8:19.
And is this something that the KRV airfield regularly issues?
Yes, they've been doing it for 12 years, so yes, they do.
And what did this weather report say?
The weather report stated that the weather conditions had changed to inclement weather.
Excuse me. And what time was this weather report issued? Excuse me.
This weather report, it was issued at 8:19 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Now, I'd like to move on and talk about the actual instrument rating itself, what we were discussing earlier. How did Mr. Campbell begin performance-wise?
He definitely struggled at first, that's for sure. He had trouble monitoring all the instruments and keeping in touch with air traffic control. It wasn't until I had him wearing goggles consistently when I started noticing some improvements.
What exactly are foggles?
Goggles are visually impairing goggles that force a pilot to solely rely on their instruments in flight. They simulate inclement weather conditions.
Did you see any improvement after starting to use the foggles?
Well, anybody training under me is going to improve regardless of their skill level, but I didn't see much improvement with these. He still relied on visual cues, or if I was co-piloting with him, he would have me take over. Don't get me started on his landings.
Mr. Roy, I'd like to talk to you now about the actual aircrafts in which you guys trained. What did you all start in?
We started in Anhold N30. It's the standard plane I use for all my students because it has all the basic instruments that a pilot would need to know how to use.
And did that ever change?
Yes, in about mid-June, we switched to a plane that respawned, the Horizon P229 with the registration N985MT, but we just called it the N98.
And how do those two planes compare?
In the broadest of sense, they're fairly similar, but no two planes are ever alike. And especially for an inexperienced pilot, there's always an adjustment period when you're switching to new planes. And if I noticed one difference between the Horizon and the and hold, I would say that the Horizon T229 had a bit touchy controls and was a bit sensitive when landing.
In either of those planes, during your training sessions, did you record those training sessions anywhere?
Yes, during the instrument rating lessons that I had with Mr. Campbell, I recorded all of our training sessions in logbooks.
Would you recognize a copy of yours and Mr. Campbell's logbook?
Yes, I'm sure I would.
Your Honor, permission to approach opposing counsel with a copy of Exhibit 13. Excuse me. Cool. You're welcome to hold it. Mr. Roy. Your Honor, would you like a courtesy copy?
Yes, please.
Mr. Roy, what is it that you're holding?
This is the logbook that I had with Mr. Campbell during his instrument rating lessons.
And is this something that you filled out every single time that you flew?
Yes, it is. And I filled out with all my students at standard.
And so it's standard practice for a person, for your business?
Correct.
Now, Your Honor, the plaintiff now moves to enter Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Any objections?
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Let's hear it.
Your Honor, would you like to listen to the response?
Yes, let's hear the response.
Your Honor, this falls under an exception to hearsay under Rule 8036. This is a regularly conducted piece of business practice. As I established with Mr. Roy on the stand, I asked him if this is something he does with all of his students. If he recorded flight logs every single time he flew with Mr. Campbell, we've laid the appropriate foundation.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor, we do not believe that all prongs, there are 5 prongs met for the records of regularly conducted business activity, and we do not believe that they have satisfied prong which is that this is a testimony of the custodian or another qualified witness.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Roy, being the owner of his flight school, serves as the custodian.
I stand by my motion.
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and admit this, under the another qualified witness, since this is his own business, and they did say, lay the foundation for him being able to show all of this.
Yes, Your Honor.
It is admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Roy, when did you begin flight training in the first plane?
In the first plane, we began flight training in May 18th.
And when did that transition occur from the first plane to the second plane?
The transition occurred on June 12th.
Now, from the beginning, from that May date that you just mentioned, to the end of the logbook, how many hours were recorded for Mr. Campbell's instrument rating training?
Done that. 17.2 hours.
And Mr. Roy, of those 17.2 hours, how many hours were spent in that new plane?
10.2 hours.
And how many hours are required for a pilot to earn his or her instrument rating?
40 hours.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Nothing further, Your Honor, we pass the witness.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Can I proceed?
You may.
Good morning, Mr. Roy. Now, there are many certifications that it takes to become a pilot, is that correct?
Yes,
And these certifications govern what kind of plane someone can fly,
correct,
where they can fly.
correct.
Now, Mr. Campbell passed his PPL exam, is that correct?
Yes, with the bare minimum number of hours required.
Mr. Roy, even with the bare minimum number of hours, he passed on his first try.
Yes, by some miracle.
Now, on direct examination, you said that Mr. Campbell switched the plane that he was using, is that correct?
Correct, he did.
And just to clarify, he flew in this first plane 7 times. Horizon P229 6 times before the 4th of July flight. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you said that he spent 17.2 total hours working towards his instrument flight rating. Is that right?
Yes, that would be correct.
And you said that he spent 10.2 of these hours on the Horizon.
Yes, that's correct.
So more than half of these hours were spent training on the Horizon P229. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And just to clarify, on July 2nd, you believe that Mr. Campbell's instrument flight rating skills were fine.
Yes, I thought they were near satisfactory.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Brief redirect, Your Honor. Mr. Roy, earlier you mentioned that you recommend to your students 60 to 80 hours of flight training prior to the private pilot's license exam.
Yes, I recommend at least 60 to 80 hours of flight experience.
And how many hours did Mr. Campbell complete?
Mr. Campbell only completed for his instrument rating 17.2 hours.
Excuse me, Mr. Roy. How many hours of training for his private pilot's license did Mr. Campbell complete?
My apologies. For his PPL, Mr. Campbell only completed 40 hours.
Can you explain to the jury why that disparity between 40 and 60 to 80 is important?
Obtaining these extra hours, these extra 20 to 40 hours for a student helps a pilot see different scenarios in the air. This extra experience really helps a pilot be ready for whatever is put in front of them.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Nothing further, Your Honor. I simply ask that Exhibit 13 be published to the jury.
Yes, it will. And you may be excused. The plaintiff's second witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls D.B. Gelfand to the stand. Please introduce yourself to the court.
Howdy, my name is D.B. Gelfand.
What do you do for a living, Ms. Gelfand?
Well, I'm an air show pilot with the Jumping Angels. We fly through my personal company, Acrobatic Entertainers.
What kind of training does being a show pilot require?
Well, you need 250 hours of flight experience and your private pilot's license. Some of us like to get the commercial one as well, if that's not necessary. However, it is very important that you have an instrumental rating or your IFR certification.
Could you explain what an IFR certification is?
Yeah, that's the instrumental flight rule certification. So that means when you're up in the air and you can't see very well outside the window, so clouds, night, inclement weather, you have to rely on your instruments in the airplane in order to get through the flight safely.
How long have you been a pilot?
Well, I've been flying ever since I was 14 years old. My daddy had me out there, cropped us in the fields with him, and yeah, God bless his soul. He passed away a few years ago, and I decided to become a show pilot, so I just love New Angels.
Now I want to talk to you about why you're here today. Did you know the defendant, Reese Campbell?
Yes, I did. He was at the same airfield as I was, Rapid River Valley. He would be out there practicing his training, talking our ears off. Honestly, he was kind of obsessed with the Jumping Angels as well.
How often on average would you say you interacted with the defendant?
I'd say pretty often. He'd have his practices with Aubrey Roy, and then he'd come, talk to us right after our practices. So we cross paths quite frequently. He'd bring us coffee and cookies. It'd be quite fun, actually.
Were you familiar with his flight training?
Yes, I was. He was training with Aubrey Roy, getting his private pilot's license.
Were you familiar with his flight experience?
Yes, he was getting his VFR certification, which is visual flight rules. So you can look outside, you can see, nice clear skies. You can rely on your eyes to kind of get through the flight.
Did you know what level of licensing he had?
Private pilot's license. did you know this? That boy would show anybody who'd look. He was sure proud of it.
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness and opposing counsel with exhibit number 8A and B.
Yes, you may.
Would Your Honor like a courtesy copy?
Yes, please.
Ms. Gelfand, do you recognize this document?
I sure do. It's a private pilot's license.
Now, has it been changed or altered in any form?
No.
Is it a fair and accurate copy?
I'd say so.
Your Honor, I move to admit exhibit number 8A and B into evidence.
Any objections?
No objections, Your Honor.
It is admitted.
Now, with the defendant's pilot's license in front of you, what level of licensing did he have?
A private pilot's license.
Does that require an IFR certification?
No. Like I said earlier, it's only a VFR certification. So it allows you to fly when it's nice, easygoing weather, and nice clear skies.
Now, I want to talk about the day of July 4th. Where were you that evening?
Well, 4th of July is a big day for me as a show pilot. We have a lot of shows going on, and that 4th of July specifically, we had one up over Basin Lake. So after that, we went back to KRRV, celebrating the hangar with a little picnic and my daddy's favorite moonshine recipe.
Do you recall what the weather was like for your big show?
Yeah, it was cloudy as hell. I remember it well.
Why do you remember it specifically being cloudy?
We had to actually change our routine schedule because it was a little too cloudy for us to do our work. So I remember having to change that.
Do you usually check the weather before a flight?
Oh yeah, definitely. Everybody does when you're a pilot. It's one of the first things you do, honestly. We have this little app at KRRB that everybody uses and gets on their phones. I'm kind of addicted to it, not gonna lie. I wake up, check the weather app, get to the hangar, check the weather app. You know, it's just second nature for me.
Did you by chance check the weather on July 4th?
Oh yes, of course.
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness and opposing counsel with exhibit numbers 9A through E.
Yes, ma'am.
And would Your Honor like a courtesy copy?
Yes, please.
Do you recognize these documents?
I sure do. They're the weather reports from July 4th.
Are they a fair and accurate copy?
Yes, they are.
Have they been changed or altered in any form?
No.
Your Honor, I move to admit exhibit numbers 9A, B, C, and D into evidence.
Any objections?
Yes, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Okay.
Response?
There is an exception to hearsay for regularly conducted business practices, which my witness has stated that this is a regularly conducted business practice that all pilots at the KRRV weather field receive, as well as her own personal business, the Jumping Angels.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor, they have not properly laid the foundation as to AO3D. All these conditions are shown by the testimony of the custodian or another qualified witness, or by a certification that complies with Rule 90211 or 90212 with the statute permitting certification.
Is that not the declaration on the back?
Yes, Your Honor, but they have not laid that foundation in question.
Response?
My witness has stated that this is a regularly conducted business practice and is an act that is used by all people at that airfield.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, last one.
Again, they have not properly laid the foundation as to as to AO3D. And this exhibit 9D, they have not properly laid that foundation or if this is a trustworthy source.
May I respond?
That's fine, yeah.
This is the custodian's certification on Exhibit 9B.
Okay. Look at that real quick. You can go ahead and let that in.
Yes, Your Honor.
Objection overruled.
Now, with these weather reports in front of you, let's go through them step by step. The first weather report, Exhibit 9A. What time was this weather report issued?
7 p.m.
What was the weather like at this time?
It was, there's some broken clouds in the sky, nothing too crazy at this point.
Now, moving on to Exhibit 9B. What time was this report issued?
This was an hour later at 8 p.m.
What was the weather like at this time?
A bunch of broken clouds up in the sky.
Finally, Exhibit 9C. What time was this weather report issued?
This was only 19 minutes later. This is a special report, which means there is a change in conditions. So in this specific situation, it's now an IFR kind of situation where there's a bunch of clouds, there's a little bit of haze, which can make visibility a little questionable.
Would you have flown in these weather conditions?
No, definitely not without an instrumental rating as well. That's just not a good idea. It's not safe.
The weather app that you mentioned before, do you know if the defendant had this weather app?
Oh, yeah, I downloaded it on his phone myself, actually. Everybody at KRRP has it on their phones, and it's a good safety thing. We need to have it in our training.
Have you ever had any conversations with Reese Campbell about inclement weather and piloting and such?
Yeah, actually, I have. He come to me for some advice, and he wanted to open his own sightseeing business. And he proposed this route over Rapid River Valley by the mountains, which in theory sounds nice, but once you get over the Rapid River and around those mountains, the wind patterns can be real questionable, and especially without instrumental ratings, it's real dicey.
Finally, Ms. Gelfand, what plane was the defendant flying on the day of the accident?
It was one of those single-engine piston planes, I believe.
And had you ever seen him fly this plane before?
No, I've never had.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
Cross-examination?
Yes, you may.
Good morning, Ms. Gelfand. You shared an airfield with Mr. Campbell, correct?
Correct, yeah, both trained there.
You saw him there pretty frequently,
Yeah, I'd say so.
and you had several conversations with him about flying.
Yeah, he'd come ask me for advice, talk to me about all this training and stuff.
And you also are a trained pilot, correct?
Correct.
You consider yourself to be pretty experienced?
I'd say so. I have my private pilot's license, my commercial license, instrumental. I got it all.
You know what it takes to be a good pilot, correct?
I'd say I do.
And in your opinion, you thought Mr. Campbell was making progress when it comes to flying.
I mean, he was making progress. I don't really know how rapid progress. I wasn't in the cockpit with him, so I couldn't really say.
But that's a yes to my question. You believed he was making progress with flying.
I mean, from what he told me, but like I said, I wasn't in the plane. I hadn't seen him do too much.
And you know that he was practicing to get his private pilot's license.
Yay.
Well, he got his private pilot's license.
In your opinion, this is a difficult test to pass, correct?
Yeah, it's not easy.
Even some of the pilots you consider to be the best had to take it twice.
Yeah.
But Mr. Campbell passed it on his first try.
Yeah, surprisingly, that was quite a miracle. I'm not gonna lie.
No further questions, Your Honor.
No redirect, Your Honor. I would simply like to publish the exhibits into the evidence.
Yes, you're published and you may step down.
Drew Hubbard to the stand. Please state your name for the jury.
Hello, my name is Drew Hubbard.
Mr. Hubbard, what do you do for a living?
I've been the owner of an aircraft crash reconstruction firm for around 8 years.
And what do you do as an accident reconstructionist?
So, after an aerial incident, I'm retained to examine all documents and evidence associated with the crash in order to put together what happened.
What education and training do you have that qualifies you?
Sure, so I got my bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and my minor in aerospace studies from the University of Georgia. Go Dogs. And after that, I went to the Embry-Riddle University to pursue a master's in aviation before then working for the National Transportation Safety Board, or the NTSB, as a lead investigator for a couple of years.
Do you still maintain any pilot certification?
While I no longer fly professionally, I still maintain my commercial pilot's license and my instrument rating.
And how are you involved in today's case?
I was retained to conduct an examination into the crash of a Horizon P229, and in my investigation, I covered the causes and circumstances surrounding its crash.
Did you reach a conclusion in today's case?
I did.
Was that conclusion reached with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Of course, that's my job.
Did you have sufficient facts and data to reach this conclusion?
Absolutely.
What were the materials you reviewed?
In my investigation, I reviewed the flight data recorder and GPS tracking systems, crash site photographs, lighting conditions, weather conditions, FAA public records, and air traffic control communications.
Did you interview any witnesses?
I didn't find the need to.
Did you go to the actual crash site?
Again, I didn't really need to. That's more for the NTSB.
Did you have a principles or method that you applied to the facts of today's case?
Yes, so in this case, I applied something called the BAD method, and despite its name, it's actually the gold standard for evaluating crashes in our industry.
What does the BAD method stand for?
It's a simple acronym for the stages of flight. B is before takeoff, A is after takeoff, and D is during inclement weather.
And did you use this method to produce a conclusion according to the facts and data of today's case?
Yes.
Before we analyze the flight, let's talk about the flight path itself. Are you familiar with Mr. Campbell's planned flight route and actual path taken that day?
I am.
Your Honor, at this time, I ask permission to approach opposing counsel with Exhibit 4A.
Thank you very much.
Would Your Honor like a courtesy copy?
Yes.
Mr. Hubbard, what have I just handed you?
You just handed me a map of the filed VFR flight plan on July 4th, as well as the actual route that the Horizon P229 took on that day.
And is it a fair and accurate copy?
Yes,
And has it been altered or changed in any way?
it is not.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff moves to construct a demonstrative of pre-admitted Exhibit 4A.
You want to do so?
Your Honor, may the witness use the well to use the Exhibit 4A?
You may.
Mr. Hubbard, looking at the map, can you please explain to us the planned route?
Sure, so in that filed flight plan, Reese Campbell was supposed to fly north for 35 miles before bearing east for 12 miles. Afterwards, he would fly over Basin Lake in the Rapid River, gaining a pretty nice view, before circling back to KRRB. The entire flight should have taken around 90 minutes.
Now, did Mr. Campbell follow this planned route?
He did not.
When did the pilot start to deviate from the flight path?
As you can see, 21 minutes into the flight, the aircraft made a large, unplanned circle around Basin Lake. And then immediately after that, at 8:19, KRRB issued a special weather report saying the cloud coverage had become too thick and that an instrument rating was required to continue legal flight. And then afterwards, the aircraft descended to 650 feet and began to decrease speed before following the Rapid River.
Mr. Hubbard, when did the actions of the pilots become increasingly problematic?
Immediately following those events,
Your
the
Honor,
air-
permission to reposition before we continue since the demonstrator has been moved.
Yes, you may.
Mr. Hubbard, when did the actions of the pilot become increasingly problematic?
Immediately following those events, the aircraft then descended to 142 feet, far below the minimum safe altitude for a Horizon P229. This sudden change in altitude had caused the aircraft to drift toward Mount McIntosh, where it eventually impacted at 8:43 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. Hubbard. You may take your seats. Now that we have established a baseline for what happened during the flights, let's analyze the decisions made by Mr. Campbell. What was the method of review you used?
Again, it was called the bad method.
Let's start with before takeoff. What are the procedures, the standard procedures a pilot should do before takeoff?
Any pilot should be monitoring the weather before taking off. If the weather has the potential to turn bad, they should simply make the decision to stay on the ground.
Now, is any certification needed for these different weather conditions?
So for inclement weather, an instrument rating is required, but for marginal visual flight rules, the conditions that define what the sky was on July 4th, you only needed a private pilot's license.
Did Mr. Campbell have an instrument rating?
He did not.
Now, why should a pilot not fly in marginal weather conditions?
Sure, so marginal visual flight rules can quickly and easily deteriorate into IMC, or instrument meteorological conditions, which refer to inclement weather that can hinder a pilot's ability to fly. In fact, a pilot who doesn't already possess an instrument rating is 12 times more likely to lose control than a pilot who doesn't have an instrument rating.
Okay, so let's move to the second phase of your analysis. Please remind the jury what that step is.
This is the A, or after takeoff.
What problems did Mr. Campbell experience after taking off?
34 minutes after taking off, KWRB issued that weather report.
And what should a pilot who isn't certified to fly in inclement weather do once they receive such report?
They should turn around immediately and retrace the previously taken path to avoid a license suspension or potentially a crash.
What did Mr. Campbell do?
He chose to continue along his flight path.
And remind the jury, what time did the plane crash?
8:43 p.m.
Are there any circumstances where a pilot who isn't certified continue to fly in inclement weather?
Honestly, there aren't many. This probably boils down to simple inexperience.
Now let's move to the last phase of your analysis. Please remind the jury what the last letter of your acronym stands for.
This is the D, or during inclement weather.
What happened during inclement weather, and what conditions, what certifications were needed by the pilot?
Instrument rating.
What should a pilot who isn't certified do after continuing to fly in inclement weather?
That's a bad situation if you don't possess an instrument rating. I would say the first order of business would be to contact air traffic control.
What role can air traffic control play?
They can help a pilot guide back to a sky under visual flight rules, or they can just guide them back to the airfield itself.
Did Mr. Campbell call air traffic control?
He did, but at a point that was far too late, just 2 minutes before crashing into the mountain when ATC couldn't really do much.
Is there anything else the defendant could have done?
Sure. He could have turned around at any point. In fact, he received the special weather report 24 minutes before crashing into Mount McIntosh. He had all of that time to decide to turn around and retrace his path.
With the conclusion of your analysis, what was the most likely cause of the crash?
Given all of the evidence we just discussed, my conclusion is that the crash of N985MT was caused by pilot error. Reese Campbell should have analyzed the weather conditions before taking off, should have analyzed the special weather report that was issued at 8:19 p.m., and should have made the decision to turn around or call for help the moment he realized that there was a problem.
Your Honor, we have no further questions, and we ask to publish the exhibit into discovery.
Ms. Pavlovich?
Your Honor, would opposing counsel like us to remove the demonstrative?
It can stay up. I'm going to shift it around a little bit just to make sure it's clear for me to say that. morning, Mr. Hubbard. My name is Thomas Van Zandt. On behalf of the defense, I'm going to be asking you a couple of questions today.
Of course.
Now, I'd like to start off with something that you mentioned under direct examination. You stated that you believe this was due to some sort of piloting experience.
I agree, yes.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about the experience that you were able to investigate. You agree that Mr. Campbell had his private pilot's license, is that correct?
He does indeed.
He passed that on his first try.
He did.
And you had access to reports that stated that Mr. Campbell has begun training further for his instrument rating, is that correct?
Yes,
But he hadn't yet completed that.
he has not.
And so when moving forward with his experience, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this timeline that was presented for us. At 7:45 p.m., Mr. Campbell had the experience that was required in order to take off, is that correct?
Sure, but at that particular time, he took off way later than anticipated.
But he's following proper procedure by taking off at a time that he is legally allowed to fly, is that correct?
Actually, because of that delay, that would not have been the case, because at that point, conditions had deteriorated into marginal visual flight rules.
But he's allowed to fly under marginal visual flight rules.
The flight would have taken 90 minutes. By the time he would have landed, there would be no daylight, and he would have needed an instrument rating, which he did not already possess.
To be clear for the jury, he is allowed to fly under marginal visual flight rules.
He was allowed to take off at that one point in time.
So at 7:45 p.m., he is following proper procedure at this point, is that correct?
At 7:45 p.m., yes.
Let the record reflect that at 7:45 p.m. I've added a note that says he is proper procedure. I'd like to move forward a little bit further. You mentioned that there was a deviation, and I just want to be clear because maybe I misunderstood it on direct examination. The deviation was at 8:32 p.m. with this circle.
Yes, it was.
Now, on direct examination, I'd just like to allow you a chance to clarify. You stated that the weather report was issued after that deviation.
Sorry, I meant to say that it was issued at 8:19 p.m. I thought I had said that.
Just to be clear, so the weather report was issued before this deviation, right?
It was issued before the deviation, yes.
And this weather report was issued 34 minutes after Mr. Campbell took off?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that this weather report states that the cloud ceiling was at 900 feet, is that correct?
Yes,
Mr. Campbell never ascended above 850 feet, is that correct?
that is correct.
So at 8:19, Mr. Campbell was still flying where he could see.
He was, but we have no knowledge of what the pilot was actually able to see given the variable nature of cloud coverage at that time.
But just to be clear, based on the weather report, Mr. Campbell was not flying in the clouds?
Based solely on the weather report.
So at 8:19, Mr. Campbell was still flying under marginally visual flight rules?
If we were to only analyze the weather report, then yes.
So based on 8:19, Mr. Campbell was still following proper procedure?
Correct.
Let the record reflect that there will be another note displaying that Mr. Campbell was following proper procedure at 8:19. Now, I'd like to talk to you a little bit further along about this. At 8:42, a mayday call was heard, is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, if something unexpected had happened on this plane, a mayday call could be expected.
Of course.
So if engine failure had occurred, and a mayday call is proper procedure.
I would say that a mayday call should have been issued the moment a deviation occurred because that would have been when some type of incident would have actually happened.
But at 8:42 is when the major deviation towards Mount Macintosh occurred, is that correct?
I would say that there were several deviations before that, but there was a deviation at that time.
And just to be clear, at 8:42, that is when we heard the mayday call.
That is when we heard the mayday call.
And at 8:42 is proper procedure to make a mayday call in a case of emergency.
Yes.
Objection. This is more prejudicial than probative.
May I respond?
Could you expand on that?
Yes, he is saying that it is proper procedure to call 2 minutes before the crash, and this is misleading the jury because, as stated by my witness, you were supposed to do this as soon as you receive an advance weather report, not 2 minutes before the crash.
We don't overrule that objection.
Just to be clear, and I'll restate the question. If Mr. Campbell experienced any sort of emergency at 8:42, it would be required of him to call a mayday.
I would have done it earlier, but yes.
And so if that issue had been engine failure of any kind, mayday call is proper procedure.
Mayday call is always proper procedure in case of any emergency.
But just to be clear for the jury, even if it was an engine failure, a mayday call is proper.
One of many reasons for a mayday call, yes.
This time, Your Honor, let the record reflect that proper procedure has been displayed at 8:42 as being on this demonstrative as well. Your Honor, we have no further questions. This time, I'll pass the witness for any redirect.
Any redirect?
Your Honor, there is a redirect.
You may proceed.
Howard, was a pilot supposed to fly, take off at a time that would relieve him to return after civil twilight?
That would be an extraordinarily bad idea for a pilot that does not possess an instrument rating.
Which means that this was not proper procedure to take off at this time.
Yes, it wouldn't have been proper procedure because by the time he would have gotten back at the filed VFR flight plan, it would have been nighttime. And he is not legally allowed to fly during that time.
Let the record reflect that it was not proper procedure during the takeoff. At 8:19, was there a weather report issued that was advanced for his certification test?
There was.
Which means it's not proper procedure to continue to fly in those weather conditions.
He needed to turn around. Any further flight would have been illegal.
Meaning, did Mr. Campbell turn around?
He did not turn around. He continued on his flight path.
Let the record reflect that it was not procedure to continue to fly instead of turning around. And lastly, was it proper procedure to call at the 2 minutes before the crash or when receiving the weather report initially?
So a mayday call, which is the declaration of emergency,
No further questions, Your Honor.
Recross
Yep.
Yeah, proceed.
You may.
Mr. Hubbard, I'd like to just be very clear for the board. 7:45 PM. Mr. Campbell had all the legally required certifications required in order to take off.
was he allowed legally to take off at 7:45 PM at that particular time? Yes. Was he allowed to actually follow the initially filed VFR flight plan? No.
So just to redirect you back to the question, it's a little bit simpler. Was he allowed to take off at 7:45 PM?
He was only allowed to take off.
Let the record reflect that the proper procedure note is back on 7:45 PM. I'd also like to direct you back to the 8:42 timestamp. Mr. Campbell declared a mayday at 8:42, is that correct?
Yes.
And this is proper protocol in case of emergency.
To be candid, yes.
So 1 minute before a fatal plane crash, Mr. Campbell declared an emergency, is that correct?
Again, I would have declared an emergency the moment something happened that caused a deviation, but yes, it is proper procedure.
But just redirecting you back to the simple question. 1 minute before a fatal plane crash, Mr. Campbell declared an emergency.
He did declare an emergency.
No further questions, John.
And counsel?
Your Honor, we would ask that this memo should be published to the jury as it is as well.
Yes.
Your Honor, may our witness be excused?
You may be excused.
Your Honor, may we take down our demonstrative?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
Your Honor, the plaintiff rests its case in chief.
Sounds good. I think we're doing good on time, so how about we take a 10-minute recess? We should be here at 11. stick it from there and have to, talk about it like a regular person. You may sit. Yes, defense.
Defense calls Mr. Manning of ours to stand. May I proceed?
You may.
Please state your name for the record.
Good morning. My name is Emmanuel Navarra, but most people here in Midlands just call me Mandy.
What do you do for a living?
I am an FAA certified aviation technician. It basically just means I'm a mechanic. But I'm also the CEO, COO, the CFO, if that means anything to you, of my own company, Budgetfix Incorporated.
Can you tell us a bit about your clientele?
It's not an extensive list right now. We started in 2019, but we got our most notable client in Kohler Campbell Air in 2020. And ever since then, business has really taken off.
How did you obtain Kohler Campbell as a client?
That's the funny part. You know, Reese Campbell was with me from the start of my business. He was my lawyer. So I got to spend a lot of time with him. And eventually in 2020, he approached me to be his technician. But I'm not gonna lie, I was skeptical at first.
And why would you be skeptical about this?
I mean, no ill will to Reese. He was a great guy. And I knew Casey from this powerful, aviation family. But I'd be crazy not to be skeptical when they asked to bring me on when they didn't own a single plane yet. I mean, what was I gonna do? Up until they bought the Horizon P229.
Can you recall what date that was?
Oh, I wanna say that was on December 13th, 2020. I've never really been one for the holidays, but seeing them buy the plane made for a nice early Christmas present.
Please tell us more about your first inspection of this plane.
Well, when I arrived to the airfield, the Horizon P229 hasn't been manufactured since about 7 years ago, so it was a little old, minor wear and tear here and there. But overall, everything looked good, up until I took a sample of the engine oil.
What did you find with this engine oil?
Well, when I looked at the engine oil, 2 red flags immediately shot off as a technician. Either, this plane hasn't been looked at, let alone flown in a while, or potential engine damage. Either way, I was gonna have to do a follow-up inspection to really confirm.
Did you inform Ms. Kohler or Mr. Campbell about this?
I did. I explicitly told Ms. Kohler about my findings on the plane that day, and we agreed that I would do a follow-up inspection to confirm the findings.
When did this follow-up inspection occur?
This follow-up inspection would happen sometime in June of 2021. I know I got expedited a couple days, because I would learn that Reese wanted to fly it. So I headed down to Rapid River Valley.
And what did you find at this inspection?
This was a pretty typical inspection. I did a full visual inspection of the engine, I did a sound test, and I tested all the instruments. And once again, I took another sample of that engine oil.
Can you tell us what happened with the engine oil this time?
This time the engine oil came out clear. It was a great sign of life for the plane.
What did you do after this second inspection?
Well, after the second inspection, I was going to tell Ms. Kohler about what I found, but I actually stumbled into Reese, and we agreed that I would be on call for a 4th of July flight. But a couple days before that flight would happen, he would cancel on me.
So where were you on July 4th, 2021?
On July 4th, 2021, I was relaxing. It was Independence Day, it's a holiday. I wasn't expecting to work, let alone having my employees work. But I would learn that Reese needed the plane to be fueled because he wanted to take it out for that flight he told me about.
What did you do about this?
Like I said, it was a holiday. I wasn't expecting to work, but I called my employees to see if anybody was even remotely close to the airfield. and a Danny Idelson picked up the phone and he said he was there.
Mr. Navarro, who exactly is Danny Idelson?
Danny Idelson was one of my employees. He didn't work on the Horizon P229, but he worked with the Jumping Angels.
Did he have any hands-on experience with this particular plane?
Danny did not have any hands-on experience with the Horizon P229.
Mr. Navarro, would you happen to know if Mr. Idelson is here in court today?
Unfortunately, he's not. When reaching out to Danny to see if he would talk on this case, I would learn that he had passed away due to COVID-19. It's unfortunate that he's not here to tell you exactly what he did to that plane before it took off.
Back to July 4th. Did you ever arrive at the airfield on that day?
Eventually, I would arrive at the airfield. It was later than anticipated due to all the holiday traffic. But when I got there was no issues or concerns raised about Danny's job, so I believe he did as I told him to.
Would you learn anything else about this inspection?
I would. A couple days after the airplane had crashed, I would learn that Danny didn't wait the minimum amount of time, 20 minutes, before refueling and sumping out the fuel tank.
How long did Danny take?
I mean, when I pressed him, Danny said no fewer than 15 minutes from what he could remember.
And in your opinion, what's the normal standard of time?
The normal standard would be a minimum of 20 minutes.
No further questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness for cross-examination.
Ms. Navarro, you are the owner of Budget Fisco Incorporated?
Yeah, like I said, I'm CEO, CFO, COO, all those names. But yeah, I'm the owner.
And you started that company in 2019?
I sure did. That's when we, started.
That's when you met Mr. Campbell?
Yeah, that's when we met for the first time.
He was your lawyer?
He was.
And it wasn't until April of 2020 when Mr. Campbell asked you to be the technician for his company?
Yeah, that's when he would approach me about being his exclusive technician.
On May 1st of 2020, you became the sole technician for their company.
That's right.
On December 13th of 2020, you were asked to inspect planes.
Yeah, that's when I saw the Horizon P229 for the first time.
And Horizon P2229 was a rare plane.
Yeah, it was hard to find. They stopped manufacturing that plane 7 years ago.
And the parts on that plane were more maneuverable,
Yeah,
more sensitive than other planes.
I would say so, but I would take my opinion with a grain of salt. I'm not a pilot.
But you did say that you would not recommend this plane be flown by a newbie.
Yeah, I did say that, but I'm not a pilot, so I wouldn't take my opinion for much.
Moving on to your inspection, you found particles that resembled metal fragments in the plane.
I did. It was a sign of potentially engine damage.
This was the only problem you saw with the plane.
At that time, that's correct.
And you performed an oil change on the engine.
I sure did.
You communicated all of this to Casey Kohler.
I did, and that's when we agreed to do a follow-up inspection.
That follow-up inspection was March 13th of 2021.
That's correct.
You sampled the oil again that day,
I sure did.
and the oil came back clear.
Yeah, it did.
In your profession, after doing an oil change and getting a clear sample of oil, this means it is 99% sure that there is no chance of engine failure, correct?
Typically, but there's always a small chance.
A 1% chance.
That's correct.
You also did a visual inspection that day,
I did. It's pretty typical when I looked at the plan.
and your visual inspection turned fine,
Yes, it did.
and you also operated and heard the engine.
Yes, I did.
It sounded fine,
That's correct. For that inspection, it sounded fine.
but you still did not give the plane the go-ahead to fly, did you?
I did not at that point.
Let's move to your second exam, your third exam on June 10th. Casey Kohler called you to inspect the plane, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
You performed another oil sample on the engine's oil,
I sure did. It's basic procedure when I look at the plane.
and the sample came back clear, correct?
It did.
This would double solidify that there is a 99% chance that there was nothing wrong with the engine.
At that inspection in particular, yes.
So this means that the plane was just been stationary for too long?
At that time of that inspection, that was the impression I had.
All right, let's move to the July 4th flight. Your employee, Danny Idelson, flew the plane that day?
He did. Like I said, it was a holiday, so, I mean, none of us were expecting to work that day.
And he performed a test called Something the Tank.
He did?
And that test makes sure there's no minimum air bubbles in the tank that could cause engine failure mid-flight.
Just for the water, yeah.
And did you personally check a sample of this fuel engine oil?
I mean, Danny showed me the sample, but that was about it.
And that sample had the correct color engine fuel for the plane?
That's correct.
And that sample also had minimum bubbles in the oil?
From the sample that Danny showed me, that's correct.
And also for requirement, you only are required to test the something of the tank for 15 minutes, correct?
I wouldn't say it's a requirement, but I strongly recommend 20 minutes.
But 15 minutes is the requirement for checking something in the tank.
I guess you could say that.
And that was completed by Danny Idelson.
Yeah, he waited only 15 minutes, but I strongly recommend 20 minutes when we sum the tank.
So to your better knowledge, there was nothing wrong with the engine the day of the flight on July 4th.
As far as what I saw and what Danny showed me, that's what I believe, but Danny was the one that did the fueling and looked at the actual engine.
But to your better knowledge, after looking at the sample, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the engine that day, yes or no?
From the sample, yes, but I didn't look at the engine.
No further questions.
No redirect, Your Honor. I simply ask that my witness be allowed to step down.
Okay, you may step down.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense calls Kennedy Heisman to the stand. Permission to prepare the well of the demonstrative.
Yes, ma'am.
May I proceed?
Give me 1 second. You may.
Good morning. May you please state your name for the record?
Good morning, I'm Kennedy Heisman.
What do you do for a living, Ms. Heisman?
Oh, I'm an aviation consultant at In the Clouds Consulting.
What kind of education does this job entail?
Well, for me personally, I got my Bachelor's of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the California Institute of Technology. It certainly took a lot of late nights and an unreasonably high Starbucks budget, but it was all well worth it to be doing something that I've come to love.
What kind of experience do you have in the field?
I have done almost everything in the field of aerospace engineering.
Ms. Heisman, what do you mean by everything?
Essentially, I mean almost every position there is to do, from product engineering all the way up to diagnostics. I am someone who personally believes that in order to be great at something, you need to be well-rounded in all aspects of your field, not just one, so that's exactly what I did.
Ms. Heisman, how did you get involved in today's case?
Well, initially, the defense approached my firm about taking on this case. While my firm as a whole decided to deny this request, I just couldn't turn it down. I felt very passionate about this case, so I decided to take it on independently on my own time.
Did you prepare a report for today's trial?
Of course.
What materials did you use to come to the conclusions that you have in your report?
I relied on various exhibits such as the photographs of the crash site, the report of the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, as well as witness statements from a variety of witnesses like the plane's mechanic and an eyewitness from that crash.
How did you use all of these materials to come to your conclusion?
Oh, well, I perform what's known as an audit, also known as an official investigation, to come to my conclusions.
Is this method standard in your field?
It certainly is. It's widely used in my field, especially when there's no physical evidence to review. Audits are a highly reliable method.
And did you reliably apply this audit to your conclusions?
Of course,
And is this method peer-reviewed?
it is.
Ms. Heisman, what was your overall conclusion in today's case?
Well, when you first look at the evidence, it's easy to come to the conclusion that it was the pilot's fault. However, after taking a deep dive at all of the evidence, it is also possible that the July 4th, 2021 crash was due to catastrophic engine failure.
What indicators of engine failure did you see?
There was a variety of indicators of engine failure. Most notably, there was some damage to the engine's crankcase.
Ms. Heisman, before we go any further, what exactly is a crankcase?
Oh, of course. So essentially, the crankcase is the outer shell of our engine. It's what protects all of the stuff on the inside, such as the pistons, the rods, the crankshaft, cylinders. Let's think of it sort of like a pistachio. The outer shell of the pistachio protects the seat on the inside, very similar to the crankcase. I actually made a little diagram to further explain this. It can be a very overwhelming concept if you're not familiar with it.
Your Honor, permission for Ms. Heisman to step down and make use of demonstrative.
Yes, you may.
Can Your Honor say that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Ms. Heisman, what exactly is it that we're looking at?
So this is a diagram of a 4-piston flat engine, similar to the one used in Horizon P229. And then up here is a zoomed-in version of one of the pistons, as well as the cylinder, rod, and crankshaft, which is the components that go into the engine when the engine is working properly.
And so how exactly does the crankcase protect the engine?
So, as you can see in this diagram, the crankcase is actually surrounding all of the components that I mentioned. So let's think back to our pistachio example. The little seat on the inside represents all of the mechanisms, and the crankcase comes together in two halves connected in the middle to protect all of our essential components for our engine.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there was some damage to the crankcase. What was this damage?
So there was a hole roughly 2 by 3 inches on the right side of the crankcase. Think of it as around the size of a tennis ball.
And what is the significance of this hole?
So the location and presence of this hole in the crankcase could actually indicate the engine throwing a rod.
Ms. Heisman, what does it mean when an engine throws a rod?
So basically, when there's a buildup of tension between the piston bearing rod and our crankshaft right here, it can actually cause the piston bearing rod as well as the piston to shoot out of the engine itself. That could explain the hole as it was the same size as our piston. I actually have a way that we explain it to our trainees in my firm that can further help visualize this phenomenon.
Now, Ms. Heisman, how can you use this can and this pen to demonstrate throwing a rod?
All right, so bear with me as this isn't a perfect example, but let's think of this can as our crankcase. This pen is our piston bearing rod. Now, of course, I can't shove the pen in there and have it come out from the inside, but it'll do a good job at visualizing what could have happened that day. So if I do this, you now see that there is a hole on our crankcase, the exact same size and shape as our pen. So this hole could have been indicative of what could have happened that day had the engine thrown a rod and come out from inside the can. You also certainly heard the loud bang that the can made when I stabbed the pen.
Ms. Heisman, what's the significance of the sound that the can made?
Oh, well, there was an eyewitness that day who reported hearing a loud bang right before the crash. The loud bang could have come from the engine throwing a rod and creating that hole on our crankcase.
Thank you, Ms. Heisman. You may take your seat. In your expert opinion, Ms. Heisman, what did you conclude in today's trial?
Well, unfortunately, I couldn't come to any firm conclusions as there was a very large fire that occurred right after the crash, and it unfortunately destroyed the majority of the evidence. However, due to the report of the NTSB stating that there was the presence of the hole on our crankcase, as well as the loud bang heard right before the crash, it is certainly possible that the Horizon P229 suffered engine failure, and that ultimately led to the crash.
No further questions, Your Honor. We pass the witness for cross-examination.
May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Ms. Heisman, you're an aircraft crash investigator.
Yes, I'm an aviation consultant specifically, but essentially.
You used to work as an engineering consultant manager at Horizon Air Corporation.
Yes, I did.
During your time at Horizon Air, you led an effort to have the type of engine they put in their planes switched to a different type of engine.
Yes, the Barzillairs. I believe the Barzillairs was an overall superior engine as it had a thicker crankcase, and in my opinion, it was just overall more durable and built better than the Frenier, the engine that they were using previously.
The Frenier engine that you mentioned, it is 3 times more popular than Brazilian engines.
Currently, yes, but I believe that the Barzillaire is an incoming engine.
Now, let's talk about how your company responded to this idea. The company fired you shortly after you pitched this idea to them.
Unfortunately, yes, there was just some lack of communication there.
They suspected you of being biased towards Brazilian engines.
I guess that's what they believed, but I genuinely believe that it's the superior engine.
They suspected you biased towards this engine because your close personal friend was the CEO of Brazilian engines.
Yes.
Now, I want to talk to you about your experience with the engine and aircraft in today's case, specifically the Frenier engine. This was the engine that played a role in your being fired.
Yes, that's the engine that Horizon P229 was using. I guess you could say that it played a role.
The company that manufactured the plane in today's case was Horizon Air Corporation,
That's correct, yes.
the same company that fired you.
Yes.
Let's move on to talking about your conclusions, specifically in terms of mechanical failure. You mentioned the possibility of the engine throwing a rod.
I did.
Now, is it also true that the engine the hole in the crankcase could have come from the impact with the boulder or the mountain of Mount McIntosh?
It's a possibility.
You have no definitive way of knowing where that hole came from.
There's no definitive way to know for sure, but the presence of the hole on the crankcase and the loud bang right beforehand was what led me to my conclusion of the possibility of engine failure.
Let's talk about that bang. Shannon Shahid was the one who reported hearing the bang on the day of July 4th.
Yes, that's correct.
But Shannon Shahid was unsure of where that bang may have come from.
According to her statements, yes.
You also have no way of knowing where that bang came from.
Well, I can't know for sure, but the presence of the hole led me to believe of the possibility of the engine throwing a rod.
But you were not present on July 4th when that bang was heard.
Of course not.
Now, let's talk about your conclusion that the possibility of metal fragments contributed to the crash in today's case. The metal fragments that were found during the first inspection, after they were found, they were drained from the fuel tank. The oil was drained from the fuel tank.
Yes, I believe the oil was changed.
After this, it was replaced with fresh oil,
Correct.
and it was inspected again.
Yes.
There was no issue found with this oil.
There was no noticed visual issue, but just because you can't see it doesn't necessarily mean it's not present.
But no metal fragments were found in this engine oil.
Like I said, none that they could see.
The engine oil was then inspected again. During this inspection, no metal fragments were found.
Ones that, none that were visually seen.
And a third inspection was conducted. During this inspection, were any metal fragments found in that engine oil?
Once again, none were reported.
I want to move on to the third piece of evidence that you cited, which was the possibility of condensation in the fuel tank and the effect that that could have in terms of mechanical failure. Now, is it true that, or excuse me, it is true that water, at least some level of water, is common in any fuel tank?
Of course.
The water that was found in the fuel tank in this engine was tested,
Yes,
and it came back clear.
it did.
So 2 out of the 3 issues you mentioned were inspected by professionals,
Correct?
and they were deemed to be safe.
Yes, the presence of metal fragments in the water were not too concerning to me.
And the other 2 pieces of evidence that you cited, the bang and the fact that there could have been, the piston engine may have thrown a rod. Out of those 2, they were both circumstantial.
What do you mean?
You were unable to definitively identify where either of those came from or were caused by.
Of course I can't know for sure. As I mentioned before, there was a fire that destroyed the majority of the evidence, but the presence of the bang and the presence of the hole and the loud bang were red flags to me.
Finally, Ms. Heisman, I'd like to talk to you about your conclusion in this case. Were you able to conclude that mechanical engine failure was a likely cause of the crash in today's case?
There's no likely cause of the crash because, like I mentioned before, most of the evidence was destroyed, but it is a cause that cannot be overlooked.
Just to clarify for the jury, you did not come to the conclusion that mechanical engine failure was a likely cause in this case.
It's a possible cause.
Again, this is a question that can be answered with a yes or no. Did you or did you not conclude that mechanical engine failure was a likely possibility in today's case?
Not likely, but possible.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
No redirect, Your Honor, I just simply ask that my witness be allowed to step down.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense calls Casey Kohler to the stand. May we proceed?
You may.
Good morning. Would you please state your name for the record?
Good morning, my name is Casey Caller.
Ms. Kohler, can you tell us what you do for a living?
Of course. So formally, my title is Vice President of External Relations at my family's business, Kohler Shipping. Perhaps you've heard of it. We're quite big here in Midlands. But I am also now the sole proprietor of my company, Kohler Campbell Air LLC.
Now, can you tell me just how long you've been working at Kohler Campbell Air LLC?
About 2 years.
And what exactly does your role entail?
At Kohler Campbell Air LLC, I am in charge of all of the business side of things. I graduated with an MBA in business, so of course that's where I ended up. And Reese Campbell was my business partner, and he handled the aviation side of the partnership.
I'd like to talk about it just a moment. You mentioned a degree. Do you have any other certifications for your field?
Yes, I graduated class of 2016 from Midland State with a bachelor's in psychology, and I grew up in the family business. So it was only natural that I graduated with my MBA in business 2 years later.
Just to be clear for everyone here, do you have any experience in flight yourself?
Oh no, every time I get asked this question, I always tell them that it took me 3 tries to pass my driver's exam on the ground. So I can't imagine steering anything in the air.
So do you have a pilot's license at all?
No, I do not have a driver's license.
Now, you mentioned Reese Campbell just a moment ago. What exactly was his role besides just being a business partner?
Well, he handled mainly the aviation side of our business, and we were close friends prior to becoming business partners.
whose idea was Kohler Campbell Air to begin with?
I wish I could say it was all my idea, because, the person with the business degree should come up with the business idea, but it was all Reese's idea. I mean, he was so passionate about aviation and planes and flying, and he would propose the idea a couple times. I always turned it down because I was really busy at my family's business, but when the economic conditions aligned, we both decided that it was the business for us.
Now, does your company have any aircraft or machinery that you own?
Yes, we purchased the Horizon P229 plane.
Are there any policies or procedures that you use in order to make sure that it stays functional?
Yes, of course. When we first purchased the plane, we outsourced that maintenance from Budget Fixed Co., and they did an initial inspection of the plane and several follow-up inspections.
I'd like to be clear, did you or Mr. Campbell ever do any personal maintenance on that plane?
No. The only thing I've ever tried to fix in my life is my relationship with my mom. That really didn't go well. So again, I'm leaving all maintenance up to Budget Fixed Co.
Did anyone at Budget Fix Co. report any issues to you following this inspection?
Yes, one minor issue about the oil being dirty, something like that. I later learned that it's quite common for planes that have been sitting idly for too long. And since we bought this plane from an out-of-business flight school, I wasn't surprised. So I notified our mechanic to fix it immediately and let me know if there's any other issues with the plane.
To the best of your knowledge, was that issue ever resolved?
Yes, it was.
And was Mr. Campbell aware of this issue?
No, I did not bring up the issue to him. I didn't want to worry him about the plane because he was really passionate about this type of plane. I didn't want to have him worried.
Moving forward from this initial inspection, did Budget Fix Incorporated ever report any other issues to you?
No other issues from the plane were seen.
So was Mr. Campbell ever cleared to fly the Horizon P229?
Yes, he had his private pilot's license and he had the correct licensing, and we also got the thumbs up from our mechanic, Mandy Navarro.
To the best of your knowledge, how many times would Mr. Campbell go on to fly that plane?
To my knowledge, I believe he flew the plane 4 times while practicing, and then 1 time would be the day of the flight, so 5 times.
Did Mr. Campbell ever report any issues to you regarding this plane?
No, he never reported any issues with the plane to me.
Now, Ms. Kohler, have you been present at all throughout all of today's trial?
Yes, I have.
Do you recall when Mr. Navarro got up on the stand to testify?
Yes, I do.
So, Mr. Navarro said some interesting things about what happened after the July 4th inspection. Did you ever talk to Mr. Navarro after July 4th?
Yes, after I found out about the flight, I was obviously upset. So I called him on July 7th, and I asked him if he did anything to the plane, if he missed anything in any inspection, if anything could have possibly happened.
Did he report any issues to you at that time?
At that time, with the phone call, no issues were brought up to me.
So when you heard about the inspection today done by Danny Idelson, had you ever heard about that before at all?
No, I never heard about that before today.
I'd like to give you the opportunity to be clear for the jury. Did you have any reason to believe that the Horizon P229 shouldn't be flying on July 4th?
No, I mean, Reese was clear to fly that plane, and no issues were reported to me day of, and it was clear to fly that plane several days before that plane.
If any issues have been raised to you or to your business partner, Mr. Campbell, what would your business's protocol have been regarding whether or not he could fly that day?
I mean, it's quite simple. If it was unsafe for him to fly, he simply wouldn't have flown. I mean, it's ridiculous to assume that if we knew what kind of harm this plane ride would have caused, it's ridiculous to assume that he still would have gone through with it. he shouldn't be blamed for something that isn't his fault.
No further questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness for cross-examination.
Thank you, counsel.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
Yes, go ahead.
Ms. Kohler, I'd first like to offer my condolences for your loss. Reese Campbell and you co-founded the defendant in today's case, Collar Campbell Air LLC.
Yes, we were partners.
Now, Reese wanted to be a tour guide pilot for Collar Campbell,
Yes, he did.
and on the day of the crash, July 4th, you received a call from Reese.
Yes, he called me that morning, ecstatic and excited.
That's right, he was excited. He wanted to try out a flight route that evening.
Yes, he did that evening.
And that flight route was around the Rapid River Valley,
From what he told me, yes.
near Mount McIntosh.
Yes.
He wanted to see if that route lived up to his imagination.
That's correct, yes.
Now, he'd flown that route before.
I'm sorry?
He'd flown that route before,
Yes, he had.
but he'd never flown it at sunset.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Now, Ms. Kohler, you knew that Reese Campbell had his PPL, private pilot's license,
Yes, he had that license.
and that allowed him to fly when he could see out the window.
Could you clarify what that means?
He was allowed to fly when he had clear vision,
Yes, that's correct.
and he was allowed to fly before night.
Yes.
To be very clear, that test flight, for that evening of July 4th was scheduled for sunset.
Yes, I believe so.
Now, Ms. Kohler, I'd like to talk about what you don't know about Mr. Campbell. You've never been in a cockpit with him.
No, I've never had a chance to fly with him before his passing.
That's exactly right. You never got the chance to be in a plane with Mr. Campbell at all.
That's correct. We actually had a flight planned, but I had a meeting come up. I do work for two big corporations, so I'm quite busy and I didn't get the chance to go.
But you don't believe this was Reese's fault.
No, I do not believe it was his fault.
You don't believe it was Reese's fault, but you have no idea how he is as a pilot.
No, but I do trust that he was a licensed pilot and he had all the correct certifications.
I believe you, Ms. Kohler, but you've never been in a plane while he was flying.
That's correct. I never had the chance.
Now, I'd like to talk about a time a little while before the date of the crash, later in May. You were at a party,
Yes, we were celebrating Reese getting his pilot's license.
and Morgan Felder, one of the men in the crash, he was at that party as well.
Yes, he was, I remember.
You talked to Morgan.
Yes, we had a small conversation.
Morgan asked you if you really thought Reese would make him go on that flight.
Yes, he did ask me this.
And to that, Ms. Kohler, you responded, not if you value your life.
Yes, but at the time I was joking. Not everybody gets my humor, but I was making a joke.
I understand, but that is a yes. You said not if you value your life in response to, do you think Reese will ask you to go on this flight?
Yes, I did say that, but again, it's a joke. It was a joke.
Thank you, Ms. Kohler. Nothing further, Your Honor.
No redirection at this time, Your Honor. I just simply ask that the witness be allowed to step off stand.
You may sit down.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense rests our case in chief, and we would ask for a 5 to 10 minute recess should time allow.
They were still doing great on time, so we can take a 10-minute recess, so you guys can prepare for closings, and we'll get water.
So this is just kind of an educational challenge, regionals is on, next quarter, so this is the time to kind of try out.
for my closing?
Vice Mayor Campbell?
We're allowed to use any demonstratives that have been introduced at trial. Which one are you referring to?
This is the one with the 3 steps for
The version.
sufficient mechanical failure.
Okay, the burden. Would you like to, or you already understand?
Are you able to see?
Yes, thank you. You may proceed.
May it please the court, opposing counsel, your honor, and members of the jury. He had a choice, but he took a chance. You've heard a lot of evidence today, but there's one thing that the plaintiff and the defense can both agree on, and that is that Ari Felder will never see her husband again. You have been immersed in the life of Ari Felder, a grieving spouse who had no idea that July 4th of 2021 would be the last time she saw her husband. A spouse who took for granted that the pilot navigating the plane would be able to safely return her husband back to her. However, that was not the case, because on July 4th, the defendant had responsibilities he could have chosen to adhere to. The responsibility to consider his qualifications, the responsibility to consider his lack of an instrument rated, and the responsibility to know and act according to the weather conditions that were illegal for him to fly for the last 24 minutes of the flight. But despite this, the defendant took the chance on flying Horizon P229 with the Morgan Felder as the passenger. And it is that chance taken that we are here today. A claim of negligence has been brought against the defendant, and the burden of proof for the plaintiff has been proven with the preponderance of the evidence. This means that we have proven that it is more likely than not that first, the defendant did not adhere to the best piloting practices, and secondly, that it failed to adhere to those practices caused the death of Morgan Felder, the person that the defense was obligated as the pilot for this company to care for. Now, the defense tries to state that Mr. Campbell could not have prepared for this flight or prepared for the problems of this flight. However, we have proved through 3 wrong choices made by the defendant that he could have prepared more in his training, in the decision to take off, and the decision not to turn around. Let's talk about the first choice in training. You heard from Aubrey Boyd, the defendant's flight instructor, who told you that the defendant had only completed 17.2 hours of his instrument rating training. However, this is not the best piloting practice because you are required to complete 40 hours of instrument training. Now that means that the defendant did not complete over 50% of the hours required for instrument training and being instrument rating, and that was needed again for the last 24 minutes of the flight. Let's talk about that second choice left to chance, which was the decision to take off. You heard from D.B. Gelfin, a show pilot who the defendant often sought for advice. Mr. Gelfin told you that a weather app was downloaded on the defendant's phone. This meant that he had the app to know when weather reports was issued. Now, the defendant did not follow the best piloting practices because he either decided to not check the weather report that day or decided to take off knowing that there were inclement weather that could lead him to be in conditions that he was not rated or qualified for. And this is what happened in today's case. Now, the defense has tried to state that there were other intervening factors that caused the crash that were happened before takeoff, and this was mechanical failure. Now, they tried to prove this through hearing from Mandy Navarra, where she stated from you, that you all heard, that it was 99% sure that there was nothing wrong with the engine. This is because she completed 2 examinations of the engine and found no metal fragments in the engine. This is important because this means that they have not proved the first part of their burden, which is to have sufficient cause for harm. This was not sufficient as it was 99% sure that there was nothing wrong for the engine that day. Now, secondly, you heard from their expert, Kennedy Heisman. Heisman's analysis stated that there could have been a crankshaft that caught a rod and caused a hole. Now, it is important to remember that she did not ever see any photos of this engine. And secondly, it is important to remember that the engine was almost completely decimated in the crash. This means that there was no actual way of knowing if this hole in the engine was caused from the rod being thrown. It could have been caused from the fact that there was a crash and the wreckage caused this hole in the engine. Also, what is most important is that in her final conclusion, she stated that it was unlikely the mechanical failure occurred. Now, jury, if she is unlikely to state that it was sufficient for mechanical failure to occur, why should you believe that this is sufficient? This moves to my third choice that they, the defendant, made left to chance. And that was the decision not to turn around. The defense states that what is more reasonable to believe that a pilot would fly in an area where he is not fully certified? However, that is exactly what happened. You heard from Drew Hubbard, our accident reconstructionist, who stated that 24 minutes before the crash, that the defendant had had a weather report that was issued, a special report that stated inclement weather that required an instrument rating he did not have. What this means is that the defendant did not follow the best piloting practices by choosing not to turn around immediately. Also, that the defendant did not follow the best piloting practices by not contacting air traffic control immediately when he made his first deviation 21 minutes in the flight. Because of this, our expert was able to state that it was because of pure pilot's inexperience. And this was also able to form a conclusion with scientific certainty that pilot error was the main and most likely cause of the crash, which means that this mechanical error was not sufficient as a cause for today's crash. Now, jury, in a few minutes, you'll be asked to go into the deliberation room and look over the evidence and reach a verdict. But we have shown with the preponderance of the evidence that it is more likely than not that the crash was caused by mechanical failure. This means that you should return the only verdict that upholds the law, the truth, and brings justice to Ari Felder. And that verdict is life. Thank you.
Before I proceed, can I also use the exhibits or the demonstrative of 4A that you guys had as well?
Yes.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, opposing counsel or honors, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, may it please the court. He could not have prepared for this. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, every day we're faced with decisions that we have to make, choices that we have to decide based on our experiences and based on the preparation that we can have. That preparation sometimes looks like degrees, sometimes it looks like licenses. But sometimes, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we can't properly prepare. All we can do is react. And in just a few moments, the defense is going to show you exactly how this case is one of reaction, and not one that could be completely prepared for. But before we get to that point, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the burden of proof. You see, in most trials, the burden of proof rests in only one place, but you wouldn't have known that yet. You see, it rests right here. The plaintiff is the only one charged with bringing a burden. And the defense, we could have sat back and we could have said, no, all we're going to do is just sit here. But we didn't. And instead, we brought a defense that actually accepted a burden. Now, I want to explain what these burdens of proof mean just exactly. The defense, we like to picture it as a 100-story building, at least an attempt to build a 100-story building. But you only have to get to floor 51. You don't have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. It's just preponderance of the evidence. If you can get halfway there and an inch, you're over the line. But these burdens of proof, in today's trial, it's not just one building that you're observing, it's an attempt to build two. And only one can reach floor 51. Whoever gets there first, case is over. So I'd like to walk you through our burden of proof in today's case. The first thing that we have to show you is that engine failure was sufficient enough by itself to cause harm. The second thing that we have to prove to you is that engine failure was not reasonably foreseeable by the defendant. And the third thing that we have to show you is engine failure is not a direct result of the defendant's conduct. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we did this by bringing 3 witnesses to you. Engine failure was not sufficient enough. Engine failure was sufficient enough by itself to cause harm. And in order to prove this, you heard from Kennedy Heisman. You were given an example. An engine throws a rod. An explosion is heard. A plane crashes. Ladies and gentlemen, engine failure is clearly sufficient enough to cause harm. It did. You were given an example of how it would look. Just blown up. Imagine punching through a plane with an explosion heard by witnesses on the ground. For the second prong, engine failure was not reasonably foreseeable to the defendant. Now, we heard from mechanic Manny Navarro, and he told you that on his inspections, everything seemed fine with the plane besides one inspection. He found metal fragments in the oil. Now, metal fragments in the oil can signify one of 2 things. It can signify potential engine failure, or it can signify that maybe the plane's just old and it's been sitting there for too long. But unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there was one inspection that we really don't have enough information on. Danny Idelson passed away tragically. Mr. Navarro fired him upon hearing about his conduct. And unfortunately, all we can do now is look back at July 4th and look at what Mr. Idelson might have done. But the one thing that we know about his inspection, it was rushed. It was rushed, and he told no one. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you might think, well, wait, the mechanics, aren't they under them? Isn't it this job to make sure that the plane was ready to fly regardless? And I'm here to tell you that's not the case. You have in front of you a stipulation, it's number 22. And it tells you that Budget Fix Incorporated and its employees are contractors of and not employees of Kohler Campbell Air. Budget Fix Incorporated is a completely separate entity and they're not on trial today. So if Mr. Idelson did something wrong, it's not the fault of Kohler Campbell Air. Now I'd like to talk to you about prong number 3. And this is what Mr. Idelson's proves. Engine failure was not a direct result of the defendant's conduct. He wasn't employed by Kohler Campbell Air. He didn't tell anyone that he rushed an inspection, that he hadn't followed Mr. Navarro's standards. Let's be clear, the defense doesn't believe Mr. Navarro did anything wrong. We don't think he was wrong for hiring Mr. Idelson. We don't think any of his previous inspections were conducted poorly, but a rushed inspection the day of a fatal plane crash, ladies and gentlemen. Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what you heard from the plaintiff today. you're shown an exhibit, and you have it in front of you, but with some edits on it. You see this timeline, it shows you the time of takeoff. It shows you steps along the way. It shows you 8:19 is the time of a special weather report issued. 34 minutes after takeoff, a special weather report comes out. It shows you the time 8:42 is a Mayday call. It shows you the time 8:43 is a plane crash. Now, using this demonstrative, the plaintiff's expert, Mr. Hubbard, tried to make it sound like he was breaking protocol throughout. Repeat, 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 protocol being broken left and right. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that's simply not true. Because on cross-examination, Mr. Hubbard agreed that Mr. Campbell was cleared to fly at 7:45 p.m., cleared to take off, breaking no laws. He was following proper procedure during takeoff. He could see visual flight rules only. 8:19, something unexpected happens. A change. The weather begins to shift, clouds roll in. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you were told that the cloud ceiling was at 900 feet. And the plane only ever reached 850 feet, and at the time of the special report, you were told that the plane started to descend. Nothing dangerous, a slight descension, but an important one. One that meant Mr. Campbell could still see. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that's the stipulation in his license. Can he see? He's not after sunset yet. You never heard any testimony saying that he was. He can see. He's following his guidelines. He's following his procedures. But what did you learn from this map? Ladies and gentlemen, at 8:42, you were told there was a loud bang. One like our expert, Ms. Heisman, told you you would hear if an engine had thrown a rod. At 8:42, ladies and gentlemen, you saw the plane jerk erratically towards the mountain. At 8:42, ladies and gentlemen, you heard a Mayday call, just like if you had been in an emergency. You heard a Mayday call declaring he couldn't see, declaring an emergency. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that Mayday call was proper procedure. And this is where the burden of proof that we take on becomes interesting. You see, we don't have to prove to you. Our burden of proof is to show you that there was a superseding and an intervening cause. So let me break that down. That if Mr. Campbell did anything wrong during the rest of this flight, if an engine failure occurred that caused that crash, it doesn't matter anymore. Now, we don't believe that Mr. Campbell did anything wrong at all, but I want to be clear for you. Because we've laid the boundaries that engine failure has occurred. A superseding and intervening cause. Engine failure occurred, so whatever else happened on that flight is out the window. It doesn't matter, because engine failure caused a crash. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've met our burden. We've proved to you that engine failure is sufficient to cause harm. You've heard from Ms. Heisman. She told you how dangerous it would be. We've proven that engine failure was not reasonably foreseeable to the defendant. We've told you that the inspections had been cleared, but on a third prong, it was not a direct result of the defendant's conduct. A rush inspection was performed on the day of a fatal flight by someone that's not on the defense. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened that day? A loud bang. A jerk towards a mountain. A Mayday call. And a crash. Engine failure occurred on July 4th, ladies and gentlemen. And because engine failure occurred, that's why we asked you find Kohler Campbell air, not live. Thank you. Is there any rebuttal?
Your Honor, may I proceed with the rebuttal?
Yes, just one note, Counselor, for next time, just make sure you reserve your time at the beginning of your closing, your time for rebuttal. But you may go ahead and do so.
Thank you.
Would you like the demonstrative still, or is there?
That was all. remember, Your Honor, that Danny Idelson only filled the plane, and that was also checked by Mandy Navarro, who was 99% able to make sure that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the plane. Now remember, he continued to fly for 24 minutes without an instrument.
Okay, yes, case is adjourned, everybody can breathe, tournament's over. If you guys would just give us a few minutes to just finish, writing everything and grading, and then we'll